Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2 is just a couple of weeks away, and it has been a while since we got any kind of animated content, so I thought it would be useful to do a full recap of the show for those who need it. We'll be covering everything from the Cursed Child's arc to the Death's Paintings arc, so let's get into it. The story starts off with the frightened teen Yuta Okotsu, who is being haunted by the cursed spirit of his dead friend Rika. Yuta has no way to control Rika and she's killing people around him. After one incident, he is basically kidnapped by Jujutsu sorcerers and introduced to Satoru Gojo, who takes him to Jujutsu High to prevent him from hurting others, and so he can become a stronger sorcerer in the hopes that he will be able to control Rika. We get this super dramatic walk in the woods before he's introduced to the other first years Maki, Inumaki, and Panda. They almost kill him, but come around to him rather quickly. Yuta is then assigned his first mission with Maki. It doesn't go well. They get eaten and Maki almost dies, but Rika saves them. Yuta then goes on another mission with Inumaki. This one's a bit more successful, except for the creepy guy that's watching them. This is our first major antagonist, Geto. He can control curses and he wants to get control of Rika so he can beat Gojo. He's also a little bit insane. Geto then visits Jujutsu Tech and basically says he's going to throw an evil parade. This forces the majority of Jujutsu sorcerers to focus on said parade, leaving the students alone at the high school, which is, of course, where Geto goes. He incapacitates Maki, Inumaki, and Panda pretty easily, which makes Yuta mad. He and Rika fight together to beat Geto, and it goes pretty well until Geto uses his maximum technique, forcing Yuta to profess his love to Rika, which opens her eye and lets her fire a gigantic laser, which overwhelms Geto. He escapes alive, but then runs into Gojo. They talk for a bit, and then Gojo tells him that he's still his best friend, and then Geto dies. After that, Yuta goes overseas and a new first year is introduced. He's tasked with finding the cursed object Sukuna's finger. This is Megumi, and he ends up at the same school as Yuji Itadorio while looking for the finger. But before we can get into this arc, it's time for a family death. Yuji's grandfather dies, and it pretty much gives him all the motivation he needs thanks to his dying message. After he's been cremated, Megumi approaches Yuji about the finger, and Yuji tells him the occult research club has it. They hurry over to the school as the kids are in danger, and Megumi rushes in while Yuji monologues about having a good life before swooping in to save his friends. After a brief moment of calm, a huge cursed spirit explodes out of the wall trying to get the finger. Yuji holds on to it for dear life, but in the end he has no choice but to eat the finger, resurrecting Sukuna. Megumi realizes this is a dire situation and he tries to summon something, but it turns out Yuji can still control his body. Then Gojo shows up, harasses Megumi, and fights Sukuna for a bit, before knocking out Yuji. We then get a brief overview of the world of Jujutsu as Yuji is introduced to Jujutsu Tech Tokyo, where he has to pass a test from Masamichi to make sure his motivations are strong enough for the world of Jujutsu. They are. Gojo, Megumi, and Yuji then go to pick up the last first year Nobara, who immediately asserts her dominance. The trio are then sent on a quick mission where Nobara almost dies, but ultimately saves the day after being saved by Yuji. We then get a bit of her backstory, and at the same time, Gojo talks about what makes a good Jujutsu sorcerer. The mission is a success, and the students are sent on another mission a month later. This one is at a juvie center, and things don't go as well this time. They have to defeat a cursed room that could become a special grade cursed spirit. Upon entering the detention center, Megumi notices it's an incomplete domain, but he's not too worried because his dogs can smell threats. They find a dismembered body and Yuji wants to bring the body back. Megumi doesn't because they don't have time. They argue for a while, but it ultimately gets interrupted because Nobara gets abducted. This is also when Megumi's dog gets crushed in a wall, and then the finger bearer appears. Megumi leaves Yuji to save Nobara, and once those two are out of the domain, Yuji switches with Sukuna. He easily destroys the finger bearer, eats the finger, and lets Yuji take over his body. Just kidding, Yuji doesn't come back for some reason, so Sukuna decides to mess with Megumi a little bit. They fight, Megumi gets obliterated, and then tells Yuji that he has no regrets about saving him before Yuji dies. We are then introduced to the disaster curses and Geto again. Meanwhile, Nobara and Megumi are not taking Yuji's death super well, but the second years help cheer them up. They tell the first years about the Tokyo Goodwill event, and both of them agree to get stronger for Yuji. Speaking of Yuji, he might not be dead. He makes a pact with Sukuna that will bring him back to life, and in exchange, Sukuna gets control of Yuji's body for 1 minute after staying in chain. This binding vow is also dependent on Yuji forgetting about it, but he takes the deal and comes back to life. He rises from the dead at the same time that Gojo is renting to Ijichi. After celebrating his rebirth, Gojo asks Shoko to keep Yuji dead on official reports so he can be trained in secret. Back with Geto, he tells the cursed spirits about the plan to potentially seal Gojo, so cursed spirits can take their rightful place on top of the world. Then Gojo starts training Yuji, and Megumi improves his technique. Then Jogo tries to kill Gojo, but it doesn't really work. Instead, it gets turned into a learning moment as we get an explanation of domain expansions, and Jogo gets, well, decapitated. But he doesn't die because he's saved by Hanami. They head back to their hideout and we're introduced to a new curse, Mojito. At the same time, Gojo decides it's best for Yuji to return to public living with the Goodwill event. Speaking of which, a couple of Kyoto students visit with the principal, and it doesn't take long for a fight to break out. Todo and Megumi go at it for a while, and Nobara and Mai wrestle off screen. The fight is broken up by Inumaki and Panda, but it works out because Todo has to see Takada-chan. Gojo then threatens Gakuganji while Miwa simps for him. Not that I can blame her. They spit for a bit before Gojo leaves and Miwa gets a picture. A month later, there's some funky people found in a theater, and Yuji is sent to investigate with the new sorcerer, Nanami. But first we get introduced introduced to Junpei, who is a victim of bullying that is under Mahito's tutelage. Turns out Mahito is the one that was behind the movie theater incident. Nanami and Yuji investigate the crime scene before following some residuals to a baseball stadium where they find some more cursed spirits. Except it's not cursed spirits, it's transfigured humans. Killing these things makes Yuji uncomfortable, but Nanami assures him they were already beyond saving. Meanwhile, Junpei gets an explanation on how cursed spirits manifest, and shortly after, he is identified as a person of interest. So Yuji is tasked with tailing him with a fly head. At the same time, Mahito and Nanami enter combat, and it seems like Nanami's technique is not great when facing Mahito. Junpei and Yuji talk after scaring off a teacher, and Nanami enters overtime. His fight ends shortly after. As the sun sets, Yuji and Junpei talk before Junpei notices Yuji's uniform. They head back to Junpei's for dinner, while Nanami requests treatment from Shoko. Dinner goes well, and Junpei has a heart-to-heart with Yuji after asking him if he would kill people if he was forced to do so. Yuji leaves Junpei in a pretty decent mental space. Unfortunately, shortly after, Junpei's mom dies, as someone left one of Sukuna's fingers on the table, attracting curses. This sends Junpei into a downward spiral, so he goes to his school to kill his tormentors. Right before he can, Yuji enters the gym and they start combat. Junpei gives a big emo speech and Yuji does what he does best. For the most part, Junpei's Shikigami protects him. As Junpei continues to mourn and suffer, Yuji offers to take him back to Jujutsu High School, where he can start anew. But Mahito interrupts, restraining Yuji and transfiguring Junpei. Junpei attacks Yuji and he tries to switch with Sukuna, but he refuses. This sends Yuji into rage and he begins combat with Mahito. Things don't go great for the high schooler, until Nanami shows up. They fight for a while and Yuji gets over his feelings about transfigured humans, and his beating combined with Nanami's gives Mahito inspiration for his domain expansion. It traps just Nanami inside, and we are given his backstory as it looks like the end is near. But Yuji breaks in at the last second because domains are weak from the outside. Mahito touches his soul, activating Sukuna's promise from earlier, which heavily injures Mahito. The domain collapses, and Mahito just barely escapes because Yuji is too injured to pursue. After the events of that night, Junpei's high school implements some counter-bullying measures, and Yuji promises not to lose again until Mahito is dead. Mahito, on the other hand, doesn't really care about Yuji, but wants to make sure they get Sukuna on their side. Geto agrees and initiates a plan to retrieve some fingers from Jujutsu Tech. At the same time, Gojo is annoying Nanami before deciding it's time to reintroduce Yuji to the living world. It's perfect timing because the Tokyo students are just about to depart for Kyoto, or at least that's what Nobara thinks. Panda corrects her, and shortly after the Kyoto students arrive, they exchange some not so pleasant introductions, and it's time for Gojo's surprise. Yuji's return is not appreciated. Nobara and Megumi chew him out, and then the rules of the team battle are explained. Team Tokyo reworks their plan to include Yuji, and Kyoto reworks their plan to kill Yuji, under the guise of Gakuganji, of course. Everyone gets fired up and the event begins. But before we can get into that, please consider subscribing. Over 90% of my viewers are not subscribed, so if you're watching right now, that probably includes you. I'd really appreciate it if you could hit the subscribe button, as you obviously like the content and you really have no reason not to, as you can just unsubscribe later. Anyway, Team Tokyo quickly locates a cursed spirit, but before they can get to it, Todo crushes it and engages in combat with Yuji. The other students break off and Yuji gets beat up a bit, but his toughness gains Todo's admiration, and that admiration turns into a brotherly love upon hearing what kind of woman Yuji is into. This heartwarming moment is interrupted by the rest of the Kyoto students appearing and trying to kill Yuji. Ironically, Todo saves him, and shortly after, the rest of the Tokyo students return as well. They all split up again, and Yuji and Todo engage again, as do Panda, Nobara, and Momo. Todo and Yuji work together to improve Yuji's fighting capabilities. Meanwhile, Panda and Nobara are taunting Momo, but are interrupted by Mekamaru, who requires Panda's attention. We then get a bit of Panda's backstory and learn he's a cursed corpse created by Masamichi. We then learn about a type of heavenly restriction which gives the user a ton of cursed energy, but a broken body. These two fight for a while and they're both pushed to the brink, but Panda emerges victoriously, rendering Mekamaru unable to fight. At the same time, Miwa and Maki engage in combat as well, and it turns out Mai was lying about Maki's strength. She is way stronger than Miwa, and it shows. Maki quickly overwhelms Miwa mentally and physically, leading to her sword getting stolen. We then get a quick overview of the event thanks to Mei's birds, before switching perspectives to Nobara, who is chasing Momo and trying to hit her with her nails. It's not going great as Momo's broom is too maneuverable. Momo then starts monologuing about how being a woman is hard, and Nobara is not having it. She activates her technique, which allows her to get closer to Momo, and then activates resonance after grabbing a piece of her broom. This stops the broom from working and allows her to beat the shit out of her with a squeaky hammer. But right before she can land the final blow, she gets shot by Mai. After gloating for a bit, Mai has to face down Maki, and it ends with Maki forcing Mai to reveal her cursed technique, and Mai losing shortly after we get her backstory. We then cut to Megumi running while being pursued by Noritoshi. They talk about responsibility in the context of their clans before clashing. At the same time, Miwa gets knocked out by Inumaki. He then feels an intimidating presence, and it turns out to be one of the special grade cursed spirits, Hanami. We then cut back to the building and Megumi reveals another one of his shadows, Max Elephant. This shadow sends Noritoshi flying out of the building, and Megumi chases him on foot before being interrupted by Hanami and Inumaki. Inumaki commands them to run away from the massive roots, and as they're running, a curtain begins to fall over the arena. All of the teachers rush towards the curtain, but they don't make it in time. Turns out the only one that is affected by this curtain is Gojo. So Utahime and Gakuganji enter. Megumi quickly recognizes the curse from Gojo's drawing and tries to contact the sorcerers outside the curtain, but Hanami breaks his phone. The trio tries to escape while using a combination of cursed speech and piercing blood, and they just barely make it outside before Inumaki and Camo hit their limits. Inumaki is just enough for one last command. It barely does anything to the curse, but it does give Maki and Megumi time to engage, this time with Playful Cloud, which is much more effective, knocking Hanami into the river. Megumi follows up with an attack from Divine Dog Totality, but it's not much longer before this duo is stopped in their tracks, and they can't do anything. Luckily, they don't need to. Todo, Yuji, and Panda arrive shortly after, with Momo saving several students as well, leaving the curse to Todo and Yuji. Todo uses this opportunity to get Yuji to grow again by forcing him to land a black flash before he intervenes. After a few attempts and a slap, it works. Yuji lands his first black flash, catapulting him into a new realm of sorcerers. With that, the battle against Hanami begins in earnest. The duo is launched into the sky on a mess of roots, and they try to attack Hanami, but the roots disappear and they are sent hurtling to the ground. Upon landing, the battle only gets more intense, and Todo decides it's finally time for him to use his curse technique. But first we get a flashback to Todo in middle school, where we see him beating up some people and meeting a mysterious woman. Back in the present, Todo is ensnared by a vine. He's spent hurtling towards a spiky knoll, but he claps, switching places with Hanami at the last second. Boogie Woogie now becomes the center of the fight, and we see a myriad of ways it can be applied. We learn Todo has a crazy IQ before seeing the final application of Boogie Woogie, which is swapping spots between a person and a cursed tool. This swaps Yuji with Playful Cloud, using the weapon to land a critical hit on Hanami. It forces the cursed spirit to activate the flower on its arm and open its domain, but the curtain disappears at the last second with Gojo in its place. He assesses the situation before mutilating Juzo. Oh, and I guess Haruda's here harassing some women too. Gojo then uses Hollow Purple, which almost kills Hanami. The curse barely gets away, but the operation was an overall success for the curses, as Mihiro stole 3 Death's paintings and at least 1 finger of Sukuna. The villains then regroup and devise their next plan. Meanwhile, at Jujutsu High, Ijichi goes over the losses, both of life and cursed objects. The adults decide it's best to keep this information to themselves, and Mimi asks Gojo about some monk kid. After everything that's happened, Masamichi wants to cancel the exchange event, but Gojo convinces him not to. The first years are talking about what happened, and Yuji is glad everyone is okay. Shortly after, the second day of the exchange event is revealed. It's baseball. A friendly game begins, and we get these cute little descriptions of every character. Camo and Yuji discuss why they became sorcerers. Yuji hits a home run, winning Tokyo the game with an assist from Inumaki. An undetermined amount of time passes, and we watch a guy get killed by a Diglett. This Diglett is to be investigated by the first years, and said investigation brings them to Megumi's middle school. We learn Megumi was a bully's bully, and that he went to the same school as his half-sister Sumiki. One of Megumi's classmates remembers a test of courage where the kids used to jump off a bridge. Meanwhile, Mahito and Geto put the Death's paintings into action. Nothing comes up from the bridge investigation until the trio goes under the bridge, which turns out to be the entrance to an incomplete domain. They find the cursed spirit but are interrupted by another being, one of the Death's paintings. Yuji handles it while Nabara and Megumi handle the Diglett. They play whack-a-mole until Nabara is forced out of the domain by an unknown set of hands. Megumi continues to fight within while Nabara is annoyed that she got dragged out. The man says that he and Kichizu are running errands, and that they won't hurt the sorcerers if they retreat. Meanwhile, in the domain, the Diglett turns out to be another finger bearer. Megumi takes quite a beating from this foe, but remembers a training from Gojo where he suggests that Megumi needs to get rid of his restraints. This gives Megumi some inspiration, and he's able to develop his own domain, Chimera Shadow Garden. This domain is not complete, but it should be enough to win. And it is. After a cool montage, Megumi and Divine Dog successfully remove the finger from the bearer's hole. We then get a flashback to Megumi's childhood, where Megumi and Sumiki are talking, and we learn a little bit about their parents. Outside the domain, everyone can feel the presence of the finger, and things start to get hairy once Kichizu and Yuji see Esso's back. This and a hit from Nabara makes Esso mad, so he activates his maximum technique, Wing King. Yuji and Nabara book it, and after Yuji picks up Nabara, they make it safely to the road, or so it seems. Kichizu appears out of nowhere and sprays Yuji with his nasty blood, and Nabara is struck by Wing King. This makes them both victims of the Rat technique, and they will be dead in a matter of minutes. It is then revealed how the Death paintings came to be, as an ancient sorcerer, Noritoshi Camo, different one, experimented on a woman, forcing her to have 9 pregnancies and 9 abortions. Each would turn into a Death painting. Back in the present, Nabara uses resonance on herself to hurt the paintings, and Yuji goes after Kichizu because he is weak weaker. Nobara continues to nail herself until Kichizu cries out in pain, causing Eso to deactivate the rot technique. The duo swap spots, and facing their new opponents, they land a double black flash, gravely injuring the brothers. Eso doesn't want his brother to die, but Nobara doesn't care. She activates Hairpin without a second thought. Despite his sadness, Eso tries to make an escape, only to be thwarted by Nobara again, before ultimately being finished off by Yuji. Elsewhere, the final painting, Chozo can sense that his brothers have died, which is confirmed by Geto. After the battle wraps up, Yuji and Nobara have a heart-to-heart, and their assistant Arata realizes she will get in trouble because she cannot contact the kids. They regroup with Megumi, who gives the finger to Yuji, but it's promptly eaten by Sukuna. The kids are all okay, and we get a bit of an overview for where everyone is at the end of this season, with pretty much everyone being recommended for promotion, and the trio on their way to meet Gojo for another mission. And that's it. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, please consider subscribing. It genuinely would mean a lot to me. But even if you don't want to, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next week for another video.